Imagine you lived in a place where you weren't entitled to your own opinion, where you couldn't freely express yourself or worship certain religions, and where just saying something that might oppose the government's beliefs or the government itself was a detriment to your own well-being. Imagine constantly being worried about yourself and those around you being arrested for speaking your mind. Some countries in the world have become notorious for infringing upon the rights of its citizens, relentlessly keeping people from exercising their 18th and 19th rights as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These rights represent the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, opinion, and expression, which everyone has the right to respectively. Three prime examples of countries that hold these rights from their citizens are Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Saudi Arabia. Our goal is to raise awareness as to some of the human rights abuses that go on every day, everywhere in the world, and to point you towards some of the organizations that can make a difference in these places.
Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government is currently led by Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn. Elected in 2012, the culture of human rights abuses in Ethiopia that began to accumulate in 2004 have only gotten worse. The government abuses the draconian anti-terrorism law, originally purposed to address crimes relating to armed insurgencies and acts of terrorism, extensively against journalists. Under accusations of having been in collaborations with terrorist organizations, journalists and bloggers are arrested for simply publishing information about such groups or conducting interviews with their leaders.
Why were you arrested?
Yeah, that's our confusion too. We blog, we were just law-abiding citizens, we respect the law, we didn't violate any single law and we didn't trespass anything, but we end up in jail. Our criminal charge says we were preparing and attempting of doing an act of terrorism. That's what the charge says. And the specific charge is to disrupt public safety and health.
By writing about the government?
Sure.
Journalists and editors of independent publications have been silenced and forced to cease production through the use of arbitrary arrests and prosecutions, leaving only a handful of independent publications left in Ethiopia. In some cases, those arrested are held in detention without charges or are even prosecuted in absentia. But it's not just the writers that are being affected. Supporters and leaders of opposing political parties have been harassed and detained, many who stayed in detention without charge. In 2014, security forces arrested leaders of the Unity for Democracy and Justice, as well as the Arena Tigray Party. Also, police have been shown to respond to peaceful protests with excessive force. In 2014, there were protests throughout the region of Oromia against the planned expansion of Addis Ababa's municipal boundaries into Oromia. Security personnel responded to this with use of excessive force, including live ammunition. Several dozen people were killed and hundreds were jailed, remaining in custody without charge.
Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia too has very little patience in terms of deferring opinions. As of 2014, a law was passed that many claim criminalized virtually any expression or association critical of the government and its understanding of Islam. Categorized as non-believers, the legislation considers a terrorist anyone who calls for atheist thought in any form or calls into question the fundamentals of the Islamic religion on which the country is based. In May 2014, a Jeddah court convicted activist Raif Badawi and sentenced him to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes for insulting Islam by founding a critical liberal website and for his comments during television interviews. Saudi Arabia also does not tolerate public worship by adherents of religions other than Islam and systematically discriminates against Muslim religious minorities, most notably 12er Shia and Ismailis. But the government doesn't only punish publications that are deemed to contravene the Sharia, which is an Islamic legal system derived by the Quran. They also punish those that impinge on state interests and promote foreign interests. Online citizens are monitored to make sure that they are adhering to governmental guidelines, and domestic mass media is under government control, having to pass through censors before it makes it on air or in print. Criticism of the government, the royal family, or religious leaders and their decisions tend to not be tolerated and do not pass the censors. Anti-terrorism regulations that took effect in 2014 can and have been used to criminalize almost any form of peaceful criticism of the authorities as terrorism.
Eritrea. The situation in Eritrea is not much better, with news only allowed to be spread by the state media, use of tight online control, and signal jamming. Eritrea is considered by many to be the most censored country in the world. Isaias Afwerki, the current president and only president since Eritrea's independence was gained in 1991, is behind the media's infringement. Afwerki began imposing restrictions by banning independent ownership of radio or television media. All independent newspapers and print media were shut down in 2001. At that time, the government locked up any journalist or politician who called for democracy and reform. These journalists did not receive a court trial. This only added to the fear of arbitrary arrests that made some journalists go into exile. Acts such as these have caused Eritrea to be known as Africa's leading jailer of journalists.
Like in 2000, and at that time it was a difficult time for the political situation in Eritrea. And immediately after 1 year, when I joined the Ministry of Information, the government started shutting down all the private press. From that moment, it was not a good environment for any journalist. I would say we had to be embedded with the propaganda. So, whatever information you see it from the government's policy. So we learn to censor ourselves, and whatever we report, whatever we write, we always are conscious of this policy. Because anybody who defies this policy, we know where he will end up. I felt like, me too, I could end up in prison one day without knowing what I did. It was unbearable for me to stay in the country and continue work as a journalist or as a propaganda personnel for the government, so I decided to leave my country.
One college student, Vanessa Berhe, stated that her uncle and his colleagues were in prison because they were considered a threat against Eritrean government. Their critical, democratic, and progressive approach has weakened the government's position in the country. The government also severely harasses citizens who practice religions other than the four it recognizes: Sunni Islam, the Eritrean Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Lutheran churches. Prayer meetings of unrecognized religions are disrupted and participants are arrested. A condition for release is often a signed statement by the prisoner recanting their religious affiliation.
Human rights are intended to bring about peace, but today, places such as Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, and Eritrea have completely violated those rights for the sake of personal stability in the eyes of the government through acts such as shutting down websites, news outlets, disregarding freedom of expression, and discarding foreign religion. These violations do not have to exist today. Individuals who don't contribute sometimes just don't believe a small voice can make a difference. Although it is true that a small amount of protest cannot sway a governing mass, a large enough voice, a collective voice, may be enough to finally give rights to fellow human beings who have had them forcefully stripped away. The only way to gain that following is through informing.